Hey. Vale. Hola. Next up is Nina Freeman with the art of making weird games. But I just realized it's still, we have still like 5 minutes until, so maybe we're going to wait for, yeah, for some more people. So I just did nothing. Ahora sí, ahora sí. Siguiente es Nina Freeman con el arte de hacer juegos raros. Y ya está, yo me voy y que hable ella.
Thank you. Hello. Thank you. Okay, perfect. Hi, you're all looking lovely. I'm Nina Freeman. I flew here yesterday or the day before from the US. I'm based in Maryland, kind of near Washington, D.C. So sorry if I'm a little jet lagged, but I'm super excited to be here. This is my first time in Spain. It's been awesome. I already want to come back. And before I get into my talk, I want to tell you that my spouse, Jake, and I we're showing a game here called Size Zero. I'll talk about it a little bit in my talk, but I'm going to focus more on older work. But our game Size Zero we've been working on for the last couple of years, and this is actually the first time we're ever showing it publicly. So we're really excited about that. It's a narrative, first-person exploration horror game set in a department store, and it's kind of about like body image and my relationship with my mom. And if you're interested, we're showing it over there, and it's the first level of the game. It's a little rough, but I don't know. Let us know what you think if you play it. All that said, I'm going to start my actual talk now. The Art of Making Weird Games. The title sort of came from my long history of making games that people tell me they think are weird. I don't really think they're weird, but I'm going to like kind of dig into why I think people think they're weird. And in case you're not familiar with my work, I am a game developer. I've been working in the industry for a little over 10 years now. I got my start making Flash games. Shout outs to any Flash developers out there. And yeah, I actually got my start at game jams in New York City. And my background is primarily in narrative games, and a lot of them are very small, and I usually call them vignette games. So a lot of the games I've worked on are basically character studies or games that take just a few minutes to play, or games about really small stories. So that's sort of like my specialty as a developer. And I'll get into showing you some of those games in my talk. I guess I should have been on this slide, but anyway, these are this is a couple of the games that I think I'm more well known for. How Do You Do It, Sybil, and Last Call being the most recent one, which I worked on with Jake, who is here. And just so you know, I never make these games alone, so shout outs to all my collaborators. I'm always working on small teams, usually of 4 people, and I tend to do like creative lead stuff, narrative design, some programming, some other stuff. I'm also a level designer. I worked at Fulbright for a while. I was one of the level designers on Tacoma. And yeah, so I have sort of the wear all hats indie developer background, I suppose, as I'm sure many of you do as well. So that's my background. Oh, one other thing that is maybe important to who I am is that when I was younger, when I was in college, I actually studied poetry. So before I made video games, I actually thought I was going to go like teach poetry or something. And then, of course, I went to a game jam and haven't looked back since. I've been making games since then. But my background is originally like in writing. So, next topic. What is a weird game? As I mentioned before, it's just a term that people have said to me that it has always stuck with me. I'm always wondering, like, why do people say these games that I've worked on are weird? And for those of you who haven't played any of my games, I'll show footage of them so that you'll have better context. But yeah, that's sort of the thing I want to focus on. So the first game I want to show you, I'm going to kind of like define what I think people mean when they say weird by showing you a bunch of the different things I've worked on and like using them each as an example. So the first one I want to show you is called How Do You Do It? It is a Flash game, and it was made over 10 years ago, I think at this point. And it is a game based on my childhood. So I don't know how I play. Maybe I hit next. Play. Oh. Laser. No. This. No. Do you know how I play videos? If you can play it on your side, I'll take it. I think you probably just click on the screen, if I remember correctly, from using it myself. Well, it wouldn't be a talk if we didn't have a PowerPoint issue, truly. I think I've had one at every single talk I've ever done. But while they help me with that, I'll give you a little extra context on this. Oh, no, it's starting. Yay. Anyway, we made it at Global Game Jam like a million years ago. That's all I was going to say. So imagine there's like cute music happening. So how do you do it? Here is the core game loop. Basically, and YouTube. Enjoy this YouTube ad that I definitely do not endorse. So basically, how do you do it? You just saw basically the whole game. It takes 30 seconds to play. You're playing as this young girl who is based on me as a child. And when I was a kid, I was pretty sheltered, and my mom is very conservative about intimacy and things like that. So she did not tell me what sex is. And of course, I was a little child and I watched Titanic, and there's that sex scene in it. And as a kid, I was like, whoa, what's that? And I was very curious, and I had Barbie dolls. So of course, when my mom was not home, I would play with my Barbie dolls and make them pretend to do the thing that I saw in Titanic, which was the sex scene. And this was truly a thing. This is true to my life. It's in the game, but this did actually happen to me, or I did that. And we were at Global Game Jam, and the theme was sort of related to projecting your sense of self onto objects. So given that theme, I thought, well, when I was a kid, I wasn't really projecting myself onto the Barbie dolls, but I was projecting this idea of what sex must be onto the dolls, and then play acting it to try and figure out what it was like, because I didn't have anyone to really teach me other than myself. So I thought, this would be kind of a fun topic for a Game Jam game. It's pretty simple, and we managed to make it in a weekend, which we were super proud of. But truly, the idea came from the night before Global Game Jam. We were sitting at a bar, and I was telling this story just as a funny story from my childhood, and I was like, wait, this really reminds me of the theme of the jam, and maybe we should just use this idea and make a game about it. And my friends were like, oh, that's so weird, but let's do it. And of course, the origin of weird game, I guess, maybe even comes from my own collaborators thinking my idea was weird, but trusting me enough to be on board with it. And I think the reason why they said it was weird at the time, even though we ended up going on to make more games like this together, like the original team that made this with me, at that time there was a lot of really cool indie games being made, like Kentucky Route Zero had come out recently, and Cart Life. That was kind of the stuff that was coming out at the time. And these are amazing games that I love, but they're quite big. They take a while to play, and they're about sort of bigger narratives with a plot structure and a longer story. But there weren't so many games that were about smaller things and that were literally a minute long to play. I mean, certainly in the Flash game world there were, but in sort of a more artsy indie game world, you just didn't see it as much, at least in the most visible category of games. So I think my friends had never played anything like that themselves. So they were like, oh, it's weird, because I think they were surprised that I would suggest we make a game that takes a minute to play. But I was super excited about this idea. And I was like, oh, it's fine if it's short. It's almost like a poem, but in the shape of a game. And so I kind of pitched them on it in that way, and they were totally on board. And yeah, so we made it, and it did it's a free game, so it did well. It got a lot of visibility. People wrote about it in the press, and I didn't know what to do at the time, because it was literally one of the first games we'd made. And I was like, whoa, people care about this? What? But we were really excited, and a lot of the feedback we got was that people didn't think you could make a game about childhood sexuality, because people don't talk about that in their daily lives. It's kind of a taboo topic. So I though was surprised by that, because actually in the poetry world that kind of topic is quite typical. So I guess I sort of have my background to thank, because in poetry, a lot of the topics that are normal there are considered quite weird or out of the ordinary in like the game development world. So from that point on, I was like, I like that I can take this background in poetry and all the poets I'm really into and sort of like apply what I've learned from them about writing to games, because people seem to be like surprised by this approach of like making something personal, making something about childhood sexuality, making something about sexuality at all. Like now it's a lot more common. I'm sure there are multiple people in the audience that have made some kind of relationship game or sex game or whatever. Like it's a thing now. But like 10 years ago, it wasn't so common. So, my friends and I making this game, we sort of like stumbled into something that I feel really thankful for now, even though it was a shock to release the game and have a lot of people be like, hey, what are you doing? Why are you doing this? So like I said, my background is poetry, and I actually wanted to expand upon that a little bit by reading you a poem that I really like to illustrate the kind of poetry that I was into. Because like, when I say I'm inspired by poetry, that could mean so many different things, right? Like Shakespeare's sonnets have a very different vibe from like Allen Ginsberg's work, for example. So for context, my poetry interests focus on poets in the New York School of Poets that lived in New York City in like, it was like the 70s and 80s. These are like the poets that I studied a lot. One of them was Ted Berrigan, and I'm going to read you one of his poems. But I'm also a really big fan of like Frank O'Hara and Tim DeLugos. Elizabeth Bishop, she's not New York School, but I recommend her. Langston Hughes, just if you want recommendations. Okay, so I'm going to read it for you. 10 Things I Do Every Day by Ted Berrigan. Wake up, smoke pot, see the cat, love my wife, think of Frank, eat lunch, make noises, sing songs, go out, dig the streets, go home for dinner, read the Post, make pee-pee, 2 kids grin, read books, see my friends, get pissed off, have a Pepsi, disappear. Mandatory pause after reading a poem. So I really like this poem and I like his work because Ted Berrigan writes a lot about daily life stuff, like, read the Post, make pee-pee. It's like normal things that we do every day, right? And I mean, in this context, it's like, this poem's kind of funny, right? I'm also a big fan of humor in games, by the way, which is part of why I picked this, because I think it's kind of funny. But the thing I find most inspiring about it is that it's a poem about, it's just a portrait of like a day in this guy's life, right? Or even an hour in his life. It's something very small. And I think that the kind of writing and the kind of art that I appreciate the most are pieces that appreciate the little details of the real world of life. Like, I'm a huge fan of, I guess we call them now walking sims, for lack of a better term, but games that allow you to like take a space in by looking at the details, games with really good environmental storytelling. These are all things that I actually think are quite similar to poetry in a lot of ways, especially this era of poetry, where you're really paying attention to the small details in an environment that tell a story about whoever lived there. And so that's sort of later in my career, though. Like, I ended up getting into the like walking sim stuff later. But originally with this Flash game work, like how do you do it? We were really taking inspiration from this in terms of making games about like one moment in a person's life. So like not even worrying about all the stuff that comes with making a 3D game with a bedroom, like that's a lot. That's a lot more. That came later. Like this was really my start, was making these tiny games, 2D games that show something really specific about someone. And then I guess this is sort of also my background, which I should have maybe been on this slide while I was just talking, but my interest in making games about small, intimate stories ended up evolving into an interest in level design and building spaces that feel lived in by the characters that the game is about. So I think this interest in ordinary life stories in games can actually evolve in a lot of different directions. And for me, it actually ended up evolving into level design, which I'm doing a workshop for this tomorrow about paper mapping and making levels. So come to that if you want. I'll talk more about it. So another connection to making weird games is, for me, I think part of the reason that I have been called a weird game developer or an experimental game developer is perhaps because almost all the games I've worked on have had wildly different mechanics. Every single game has been different. I don't think I've used the same design twice, ever. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit too. So my design methodology is usually story first. So like I told you earlier with how do you do it, the story really came from like hanging out with my friends at a bar and being like, here's this funny story. Why don't we make a game about it? So in how do you do it, we found the mechanics in the story, and I have continued to do that with a lot of different games that we've worked on, including Sybil, which I have a video, so I might have to ask you to play it again over in the side booth. Which, thank you, and apologies in advance for the YouTube ad that's probably going to play at the end of this. So while they play that, this is Sybil, came out in 2015, and it's also a personal game about an experience I had. Shout outs to any fellow Final Fantasy XI players. This is about my experience playing that in high school and college.
Not much. Want to do a run together?
So in the game, you're basically playing as me, playing an online game. And as you can see, there's these video sequences that is like real footage of me. I play myself in the game. I also voice acted myself. And the game is essentially about this online relationship I had with someone I knew in the game who was represented by the little red character. And you basically play on my computer. So we built this whole like fake computer interface where you can like look through all my old photos and journal entries and my websites. And then you like open the game and you're in a sort of voice chat with your online boyfriend in the game. So it's a game in a game. It's kind of confusing to explain, but more or less that's what it's about. Here's your ad. Anyway, so long story short, my point was that for my design methodology, I usually start with the story first and then find the mechanics in the story. And for Sybil, the story was I had the online boyfriend in Final Fantasy XI. We ended up meeting up in real life and hooked up. That's the whole story, spoiler alert. And he dumps me at the end. Sad ending. So I knew I wanted to make a game about this story. And I was in this class in college, in grad school, where we had to make a game a week for a whole semester. It was like a game jam class almost. And there was one week, I'm going to go to my... Okay, well, ignore this. I'll talk about that next. There was this one week where the theme was sex. So I was like, okay, because I hooked up with this guy in the story, I guess I'll make that as my like homework. And I made a prototype, and the prototype was basically just kind of what you saw in the trailer where you're playing as the online game, but all the prototype really was like clicking around in a fake online game interface, and like text of the chat is scrolling by. So for me, like finding the mechanic in the story was, well, it's really natural for this story because it's a story about playing a game. So I just made a fake version of the game for you to play. So almost like a MMO simulator of sorts. And, you know, when I made that prototype, I was like, but wait, I think there could be more to this. And I realized that a really important part of like playing an online game with someone and having an online relationship is that, at least for us, because we ended up meeting in real life, the game is sort of like a mediator between like two physical bodies, right? Like an online relationship is still a relationship between two full humans, right? So I was thinking, okay, well then I think a mechanic that I can find there is to have the player really like step into my shoes, sit at my desk, use my computer, and then literally remind them that they're a human by showing a video of myself, to be like, okay, so you're sitting at this computer, but like here's a video of who you are playing as. So yeah, the game ended up being like a mix of playing in the 2D digital interface, playing the game, and then like seeing short films of like the real humans that it's about. So it was kind of fun to think about all the different stages of a relationship like that. Like first you meet in an online game, and then you like talk on the phone. That's like a little bit closer physically, talking on the phone, because you have like the phone up to your ear. It's like a slightly more physical experience. So we have this moment in the game about talking on the phone. And there are a bunch of different moments throughout the game that are designed to evoke the evolving physical closeness of two people. So yeah, basically, long story short, we had this story, and I was like, okay, what are the mechanics that are natural to the story, and let's use those to make this game. And I thought about that more actively when we were working on Sybil, but looking back to how do you do it, even though I wasn't fully conscious of it, we basically did that with that game too, because we had the story, and I was like, oh yeah, I played with dolls as a kid, I pretended they had sex. And the mechanic in that game is pressing two buttons to slam your hands together. So like that mechanic came out of that story as well. And I guess I'm sharing this because everyone has very different ways of designing games, right? Like some people will make a mechanic first that they really like and write a story that matches up with it. And that is a totally valid way to design a game. But you can also start with a story and say, what is a game mechanic that this story can teach me that doesn't exist in any other game yet? And I think that when you make a game in that style, you might end up making a weird game, quote unquote, because you're coming up with like an entirely new mechanic that no one has ever seen before, because it's coming from a story that only you can make. So it's also a mechanic that only you can make, which is kind of cool. And so I really like to design games that way. And I like to tell people about that approach because I'm just really into experimental games. I like weird mechanics that sometimes don't even make sense. Like as long as they convey the story, I'm happy. And I think that it can be a very freeing way to think about games, to just like find a story and then search for the mechanic inside of it. I'm going to take a drink of water, and then I'm going to talk about getting burned out on sad games. Because Sybil is very sad, that's why. Okay, so Sybil is sad because in the end I got dumped. It wasn't like fun to relive that memory, but it had happened like 8 years before, so I was like, whatever. Actually, fun fact, the guy that game is about reached out to me because he saw a Polygon article about it. So that was weird, but he was like, oh, that's really cool that you like make video games now. And I was like, thanks. Is it okay that I made a game about us? And he was like, yeah, whatever. His real name isn't in the game, and I obscured all of his personal information, obviously. But Sybil was my real MMO handle, so when he saw it, he instantly knew it was me. So anyway, after we shipped Sybil, which was really intense because it was actually my first commercial project, we like sold it. After we made that, I was like pretty burnt out on making sad games, and I wanted to make something happier for a while, and I actually didn't, not right after Sybil. It took me a couple more sad games to fully get it out of my system, but I knew deep down inside that I really wanted to make a funny game. More like, how do you do it? Like, how do you do it? The first game I showed y'all about the dolls, like that really came from a place of liking humor, because it's kind of a funny story. And then I made a bunch of sad games with my friends, and then I met my now husband, Jake, who we make games together now. And when we met, we really connected over humor in games. And we ended up making this game called We Met in May. And I will request to play the video now. Thank you. So close. This is another personal game. All these games are like drawing on real life stuff, and yeah, that's us. So the game is basically a collection of vignettes that each are based on a date we went on early in our relationship. I mean, I guess this wasn't really a date, but it happened. This was a date, though. And yes, that is a Genji from Overwatch body pillow because we played a lot of Overwatch together. So, we met in May. We made that, yeah, partially because I was burnt out on making sad games, but I guess also part of it was like romantic. So I'll say that for him so he doesn't think it's just because I didn't want to make sad games anymore. So basically, one of the big differences you'll see between We Met in May and the other games I've been showing is that We Met in May is a 3D game, which for me was like a huge jump in my skill set. Basically, I went and worked at Fulbright. They made Gone Home, but I didn't work on that. I worked on Tacoma. And it was there that I learned how to make 3D games. And while I was working at that studio, I was still making my own games, including Sybil and a couple of others. And then I really wanted to like both make a funny game, but also make a 3D game. So another game jam story. Jake and I did a couple game jams, and at each one we made one of these vignettes because we thought, oh, like, wouldn't it be funny to just make a bunch of games about a bunch of dates that we remember? Because we had a few funny ones. We were like, well, we want to make like all of these games, so we just did a bunch of game jams. I think like it was like Ludum Dare and like a couple of the online ones, Global Game Jam, stuff like that. And for each one, we made a game. So one of them that you saw in the trailer is where she's like pouring the sand on him at the beach. We came up with that idea. This is a story first, mechanic later thing. We went on a date where we were at the beach, and we both realized we really like lying in the sand, which apparently a lot of people hate the feeling of sand, but like we both like it for whatever reason. So we were like, oh, that's funny. And people will probably think it's really weird that we like sand so much. So why don't we make a game about that? And another thing that Jake and I have in common is that we both like making physics-based games. Like, it's maybe hard to tell from the video, but how do you do it? Like, it uses IK, and you can like move the arms in a very like wiggly way. Kind of inspired by QWOP, if you know QWOP by Bennett Foddy. It's kind of comes from that. And actually, Bennett was my like thesis advisor, so I think a lot of what I do is inspired by him. And so for We Met in May, the game, actually each of them has like a weird physics-y based mechanic where the character has like an IK rig. And in that one, you control her arm and you like grab the sand and you pour it on him, or you grab a bottle of wine and you can like fling it around. And yeah, so really the story came first and the mechanic came from it. It was just literally as simple as, well, what if you could just pour sand all over your partner? That would be pretty funny, right? Which we hope it is. So that was how I got out of my sad game rut with the help of Jake. And that was another game that a lot of people told me and him was really weird. One of the other vignettes in it is like a nipple pinching simulator where you're playing as me and he's trying to cook dinner, and you just like, you're in like a first person shooter type mechanic and you like grab his nipple. And it was really fun to show that game, actually, because one of my favorite things as a game dev ever is to show a game at an event like this and see someone laugh out loud at it. I gotta tell you, that's like one of the best feelings ever. So, you know, I'm really glad that Jake and I both like to make weird games, because sometimes these weird mechanics, like nipple pinching or like pouring sand on someone, will get people to laugh, which just brings me a lot of joy as a game developer. So I have to endorse comedy in games, and combining that with this idea of like finding the mechanic in a story, because like, think about it for yourself. If you have any like funny story or like inside joke with your friends, that could easily become an awesome game mechanic. Just think about it. Okay, so back to sad games. Sorry, I can't help myself. Jake and I continued to make games together, and we made a game called Last Call that I'm going to talk about. Content warning, it is a game about domestic violence. I am a domestic abuse survivor. Shout outs to anyone else who is. You are amazing and strong. And we made this game based on that experience for a lot of complicated reasons, which I'll get into in a second. But I want you to see the gameplay footage first. So I'm going to ask my lovely friends over there to play the video. Thank you, and I'm sorry. And I'm going to have another drink of water. Oh, it's still black. Oop. Well, I'll tell you a little bit while we load in. Oh, there it is. Thank you. So this is some gameplay. It's hardly a trailer. It's just literally the beginning of the game. So when you're playing, you actually use your microphone on your computer to play the game for part of it. So like part of the game is the microphone inputs, but part of it is like walking around in first person, like with a controller. Yes, that is a photo of my real stuff. So just then, you can sort of imagine you spoke one of those phrases into your microphone and then the eyes opened. That's like one of the main mechanics in the game. So, welcome to your next YouTube ad. They should pay me for this. Okay, so last call. You just saw the video, but to reiterate it in case it wasn't clear, the game is a first-person exploration game. You walk around an apartment that's full of boxes that are partially packed, and you pack them, essentially. And in some of the boxes, there are snippets of a poem. And over the course of the game, you read this whole poem, and each time you find a piece of it, the game asks you to respond to it. And that's the microphone input. So you would read the poem and then say, like, I believe you. And then the game would allow you to progress. But you actually are not allowed to progress in the game unless you talk to the poem. So that is the main required mechanic. So the design intention behind this game was that I had this horrible experience with domestic violence. And I was actually working with Jake on our current project, Size Zero, which we're showing here. And we were working on that. We were really early in development. And this was also like early in the pandemic. And I was feeling pretty depressed and like was having some like PTSD issues with this previous relationship. And I was really having trouble making games at all. I was like having writer's block, but like of a game developer variety. And I actually broke out of it by making this. Jake was like, please write a poem, like do anything, because I was really struggling, and he knows that I do better when I'm making something. So he was like, write a poem, it might make you feel better. And I did. And actually, the poem was the first thing that I made for this game. It was really just supposed to be a poem that I wrote for myself. But then when I finished it, I have this habit of making games out of everything. So I was like, hey, this poem, I feel really good about it. What if I made a game that allows you to read the poem while playing it? And so the idea for the game was another story first, find the mechanic in it. And basically I took the poem and made a quick prototype where I just like put a bunch of poems in like a space that was like a couple rooms, and you like go around and you just like pick up the poems and read them. And I was like, well, that's kind of boring, and just like, it was like exactly what I was doing at Fulbright. So not boring, but like I'd done it before, and I always like to try something new. So I was like, what about this could be new for me? And I realized that one of the weird things about being a domestic violence survivor and being on social media is that you see a lot of fellow survivor stories on like Twitter or whatever. And I remember feeling compelled to share my story that way at some point. And so I did. I wrote like a Twitter thread where I was like talking about what it was like to be a domestic violence survivor in my personal case. And when I did that, I felt really like unfulfilled, and I was like, well, why didn't this feel good? And I realized that it was because I couldn't get that like direct feedback from like telling someone a story in person and seeing them nod and say, yes, I understand, I hear you, you're valid, I'm so sorry that happened to you. Like you don't really get that from social media, right? You just get an onslaught of likes, and like, it was just everyone liking the post, and I was like, oh, this is so weird because everyone's just liking it, but I don't know what that means. And so that is where I came up with the mechanic idea to have the player have to actually talk to the poem. Because that's really like what I wanted when I tweeted my story. I wanted people to like acknowledge me. So I felt that asking players to speak into the microphone in order to progress was like the closest I could get in a video game space to that acknowledgement you get from actually talking to someone about something. So yeah, I think we were really proud of that game, and I just wanted to use it as another example of story first, mechanics later, and the mechanics ending up being kind of weird. I guess people have said that game is weird because of the use of the microphone, which is why I thought to share it. So I think this is the last one I'm going to share. So all of these games, like I've said, a couple of them were made at jams. I think I've often worked with like really dramatic time or scope constraints, whether it's a game jam or like Jake and I have been lucky enough to get like commissions to make games where we usually only have like 6 months or something to make something for like a festival, for example. So sometimes short amounts of time or really strict constraints can also lead to like experimental inspiration. And that combined with everything else I've been talking about, I think led to this game, which Jake and I made for the Triennale in Milan. And I'll request the video be played. You're the best. Thank you so much. And it's called Nanu's Legend. And it's about me and my Nanu, my grandfather. This was actually designed for mobile, so you can imagine using your finger on your phone. So I'm going to talk a little while the video plays. The idea for Nanu's Legend came from, well, the theme of the commission we were given was like something related to the entire galaxy, something about space. And so we took that theme and I guess we had been feeling like going back to like our Flash roots or like 2D game roots and make another like tiny vignette game. I mean, this is like partially 2D, partially 3D, but we wanted to go back to these like childhood vignette games that I was really fond of making, combined with Jake being really good at like making weird math stuff that lets you break the globe apart. He did that. Oh yeah, here's our new planet. So yeah, we made it for this theme, and I thought back to my childhood, and I was like, oh, I used to spend a lot of time with my grandfather looking at globes. And I remember as a kid, I never got to travel really until I was older. So I always would look at globes, and I would do that thing where I spin it and then like stop it with my finger, and I would be like, oh, where's that? And just like fantasize about what that place might be. So the game is kind of inspired by that idea, which is something I did as a kid. And we only had like, I think 5 months to make it or something, maybe a little less, 4. So we, took that idea and we're like, well, what's like the smallest possible game we could make about imagining like a place you've never been? And we came up with this, where we were like, oh, let's let the player make their own globe by allowing them to like break up pieces of the world and form them into a new shape. And yeah, I think we were really excited about that idea because it was so simple. Like, it's really just one interaction with the globe. And I guess I just wanted to share it because, like, I know making games is really hard and really stressful, especially when you only have 4 months. But, if you can keep your scope small and just focus on one really specific idea, you can still come up with something like that might be really exciting to you and something that surprises you. And I think we really surprised ourselves with this game and are really proud of it. So I wanted to share it. I only have a couple minutes left, so I'm going to start to wrap it up. I've been talking about all of these games I've worked on in terms of like them being weird. Again, I don't really think they're weird, but I guess some other people do, so I'm responding to those ethereal people on the internet. And while thinking about this question, I came to the conclusion that these games mostly don't fit into a genre. They're all sort of unpolished in some way, and they're also all games about feelings, or like personal experiences of mine. So I guess I was trying to find like common threads among all the games that I remember people calling weird, and all of them like have some of these properties, and all of them were games that started as stories where I found the mechanics in them. And I wanted to focus on that for the most part, just because I know that like a lot of you all make games, and I guess I wanted to share that as like, if you haven't considered taking a story from your personal life and finding a mechanic in it, I really, really think it is a powerful tool. So I wanted to like share my own process, hopefully as inspiration to you, or maybe you just think I'm weird, and that's also okay, because I think I am too. Anyway, Size Zero is the game Jake and I are showing. I mentioned it at the beginning, but it is a horror game. Content warnings about body image, fat shaming, and stuff like that. It's a game about growing up in the mid-2000s as a teen girl, so it's stressful. But I hope you'll play it, and sorry if it crashes. And these are my dogs. And I want to thank Jake, my husband, who's made a lot of these games with me, and all my other collaborators over the years. I wouldn't have been able to make any of them without those people. I know I'm the only one up on the stage, but it's always a group effort. So that's it, and let me know if you have any questions.
Do you have any questions? Someone? Okay. Levántate para decir la pregunta.
Hello. First of all, I played...
Ooh, could you talk a little closer to the mic? It's
Okay.
kind of loud, so it's hard to hear.
First of
Thank
all,
you.
I played Sibel, and I loved it.
Thank you.
I thought it was a very interesting game.
Thank you.
and I like that it is very personal. My question is about, because you said it was your first commercial game, so my question is, how did you get to market it? Because it is a weird game. I love those. And so I think it can be difficult to find the audience for the game. So that's my question. Also, did you have a publisher that helped you do it, or did you do it alone?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I didn't really have time to talk about how we survive making these games, and I can include that in my answer because I think it's relevant. Sybil did not have a publisher. It was self-published. And how did we market it? There was no plan, to be honest. It was kind of a different time when Sybil came out. Like, does anyone remember that website, Free Indie Games? I see some people nodding, and I love that. So back then, there was just like more websites like Free Indie Games or Indie Static, if any of you remember that were like, they were like indie journalists covering indie games. And that was like a pretty big thing around when Sybil came out. So I think a lot of our core audience came from those communities and from people who had been following me and my friends' work from like How Do You Do It and from previous games. So I was super active on Twitter back then. I'm like not on it anymore, but I was very much like active on social media, sharing it constantly. You know, we did make a trailer and like I sent it to every journalist I could find a week or two before release. So I guess like I had sort of a plan that was like mostly based around getting journalists to cover it because that seemed like the best way to go back then. But I also had like a fairly big following on social media at the time that I had been building up from stuff like How Do You Do It and other games. So honestly, it was a pretty scrappy and like not advisable way to do it, but that's what we did. And we didn't make a ton of money off of it or anything. Like it was by no means a financial success. It was more of like a success within the indie sphere. And that's kind of like all we've achieved. Like nothing I've made has made any money. Let's be real. We've survived by taking commissions from museums and festivals. I actually freelance a lot. Jake and I both freelance for Don't Nod, Montreal, on a game called Lost Records Bloom and Rage, which you may have seen at the Game Awards. I'm the narrative designer. So yeah, I like basically make stuff for other people to help fund our own stuff. And that's how we managed to keep making them despite not having publisher and not having any marketing plan ever. Good question, thank you.
Okay. In most of your games, you talk most openly about sex. Why do you think that we don't see that topic not in blockbuster games or mainstream games, but not usually in indie games? Just about talking about it or even show it, but I like the way you do it in your work.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Yeah, so, and let me know if I misunderstood the question, but basically you asked like why don't we see sex in games more often, especially on like a bigger scale? Or you don't read about it very often? Yeah.
You don't show it openly about...
Yeah, totally. So one thing, and I've talked a lot about sex in games over the years, and it's funny because I feel like how I feel about it is always evolving because like the way sex in games as a topic was depicted when I first started making games was like way different than how it is now. Like I actually feel like nowadays you can find tons of games about sex and sexuality, especially on itch.io. If you're like in that community, that's like the best place to play all games, to be honest, but especially games about intimacy. But I think that topic will always struggle to a certain extent because like culturally, you know, it depends on where you are in the world and in your community, but talking about sex at all is like still a taboo topic and people are uncomfortable with it, right? In general in life, I think. Maybe not in like cool like art game circles, but like I mean in like the world at large, it's not something that people talk about a lot. And especially for me growing up, like my mom was really conservative and like she is horrified that I make these games, to be honest. She won't play them. But I'm like, whatever, it's fine. So I think that it's like a cultural issue, but also I think people who make games about sex are often like people on itch.io who are also making experimental smaller games, and games like that don't tend to get covered as often by like journalists, or like they don't tend to blow up as easily into the public view. So I think those games are out there, but they just don't get the same level of visibility as like stuff that has more approachable topics. So I think for sex in games, it's largely a visibility issue. And bigger AAA studios probably don't want to tackle it because they could get in trouble or whatever with like their audience. But they're just cowards. You can do it. Just kidding, but not really. I don't know if that answers your question, but that's how I think about that topic, is that it's a visibility issue. But like everyone go to itch.io and like play all the indie games about intimacy because there's so many good ones on there. That's it.
Thanks.
Hi. So there's a difference between games that are inspired by a real life experience and games that seem to be more like an iteration of that actual experience. Does it not feel uncomfortable or almost as if you're naked in public, so to say, to like expose those experiences in this format, whether it's a game or any other form of art? And if it is uncomfortable, how do you deal with it? Like how do you present yourself after knowing these people play these games and now have a window to part of your life that typically they wouldn't be able to see?
Good question. Yeah, I can totally answer that. So making games about personal stuff. I guess I have sort of two answers. One goes way back to when I was in undergrad, before I made games in college, and I was studying poetry. I was in a lot of like poetry workshop classes where we'd write poems and share them with the class, right? And we were studying poets that wrote a lot about very personal experiences and often about intimacy. So it was like some of the poets I mentioned before, like Elizabeth Bishop is an example. She wrote a poem that I really like that was about being a kid in the waiting room at the doctor's office, and she like saw a copy of National Geographic, and I guess as a kid she like opened it up and saw like adult boobs for the first time, and the poem is like about what that experience was like. And I was reading a lot of poetry like that and trying to write stuff similar to it because, you know, I was a student, I was trying to imitate what I liked. And in those poetry classes, it was kind of uncomfortable at first to like write about my sex life and like read it to my fellow students. But I honestly just did it so much that I got used to it, and the other students in the class were doing it too. So I think there was a lot of value to like being in an accepting space where we were all looking at work like that. We were all trying to write about our personal lives and sharing it with each other. So I think practicing that with like a welcoming community really got me started. And then because I was really active on social media and stuff early in my game dev career, I think I kind of like had that relationship with the internet, because there were other people making games like that I was connecting with over Twitter, and we'd like share our games and be like, hey, that's cool. So I was getting a lot of positive reinforcement. You know, that didn't last forever, especially like when Sybil became more visible. There were definitely haters, but I just like ignore them. So I might be a bit weird in that way where I'm able to tune that out. I know that that's not easy for everyone. But I've just like really deliberately gone out of my way to be like, I'm going to be comfortable. It's just, this is like a part of the kind of art that I want to make. So I'm just going to do it. And I think back to those poetry workshops and I'm like, just see the safe space and it'll be fine. So that's kind of how I do it. And now like, it's not something I think about anymore. I just learned over time. And I had a part 2 answer, but I kind of forgot what it was. Oh, I remember. for a lot of these games, they're drawing on personal experiences, but they're like distilled versions, so like very simplified versions of what actually happened. And so sometimes that process of like writing about myself, I actually talk about myself in the third person when I write. So I think that also helps me maintain some distance and be more comfortable, because I literally treat myself like a character. So that helps too. Thank you.
We have time for one more question. This gentleman over here.
Hi, hello. I would like to know, in your experience as a weird alternative game maker, what do you find to be one of the most unexplored themes nowadays in video games?
Unexplored themes. I love that question. Actually, truly, one of the reasons that I really wanted to make Last Call was because I don't feel like domestic violence is something that I don't think I had ever played a game about that topic. So I was like, well, I have that lived experience, and I also have this ability to make games. So, I think I did want to fill that space with something, because I think I would have benefited from seeing that when I was in that situation. So domestic violence would be one of those things. And I think just also in general, something I've thought a lot about really, really early in my career, when I was very first making games, I was an intern at Kill Screen, which was a journalism outlet. I think they're still around. And I wrote an article back then about mothers in games. And I know there are plenty of mom characters, but there's not as many games about motherhood or childbirth and things like that. And I feel like that would be really interesting to see. So I guess as far as games I haven't made myself, that would be a topic that I would be interested in seeing more games about.
Cool, thank you.
I guess that was the last question, but feel free to come find me. I'll be around, and we'll be with our game. So thank you so much again, and thank you to the organizers. You're the best.